Welcome back, everyone. Here we continue our Week 3 live chat series for Finance 4443, Financial Policy and Strategy. I'm Dr. Mark Dennis, your guide through the ever enthralling maze of corporate finance. This session's focus: capital structure decisions, why they matter, how they're shaped, and what they mean for a firm's risk and return profile. Let's get into it. The adventure continues with Chapter 12, Capital Structure. This topic gets right to the heart of how firms balance their debt and their equity when financing their operations and investments. Think of it like balancing on a tightrope. Too much debt and you risk a fall. Too little and you may miss out on returns. Let's examine what this balancing act really involves. The target capital structure. Let's define what we mean by that. Capital structure is the mix of debt and equity that a firm uses to fund its activities. A target capital structure is the firm's strategic goal, the ideal proportion of debt, preferred stock, and common equity that it aims to maintain over time. Why target this mix? Because getting it right helps reduce the overall cost of capital, and that enhances shareholder value. Four factors influence capital structure decisions. First, business risk. This is the volatility of a firm's earnings before any debt is considered. Second, tax position. Firms with higher taxable income may benefit more from the tax shield aspect of debt financing. Third, financial flexibility. This refers to a firm's ability to raise capital under adverse conditions. And finally, managerial attitude. Some executives are more conservative than others when it comes to taking on debt. Each of these can nudge a firm either toward or away from using leverage. What is business risk? Business risk represents the uncertainty associated with the firm's operating income. It is driven entirely by business operations, not by financing decisions. Business risk is affected by things like sales variability, input costs, and how well a firm can pass those costs on through pricing. And crucially, by operating leverage, which we will get to next. Operating leverage means using fixed operating costs. If a large portion of a firm's costs are fixed, things like rent, equipment, or salaried labor, then even small drops in revenue can severely hurt profits. This amplifies business risk. So, high operating leverage equals high business risk. Simple as that. Now let's layer on financial risk. This comes from financial leverage, how much the firm uses debt and preferred stock. Financial risk is the extra uncertainty placed on shareholders due to fixed financial obligations. It stacks on top of business risk. The more debt a firm carries, the more volatile its earnings to equity holders will become. Capital structure theory. Let's take a look through a theoretical lens. There are three major ideas we'll touch on: the trade-off theory, the signaling theory, and the Bankruptcy/Tax Benefit Balancing Act. We'll unpack each of these, starting with the trade-off theory. According to the trade-off theory, debt has both benefits and costs. On the benefit side, interest is tax deductible. This is a major plus. But as debt increases, interest rates rise, and so does the risk of financial distress. So the theory says this: use debt, but only to the point where the tax savings are still greater than the cost of potential bankruptcy. Here's the kicker. Up to a point, adding debt increases firm value. But once the risk of default outweighs the tax benefits, additional debt starts to hurt. The optimal capital structure is that sweet spot where the trade-offs are perfectly balanced. The problem is, it's very difficult to identify that precise point in practice. However, understanding the concept helps guide sound financing strategies. Now let's talk about signaling theory, a concept that emerged in response to a puzzle. Why do so many successful companies use less debt than what the trade-off theory might predict? It turns out the answer lies in psychology and perception. When a firm takes on debt or avoids it, it's not just about the cost. It is also sending a message. A signal is an action taken by management that investors interpret as a clue about the firm's prospects. For example, if a firm chooses not to increase its debt, investors might assume that management is being cautious, or that they expect future earnings to be volatile. Symmetric versus asymmetric information. To understand signaling theory, you need to understand information symmetry. In a perfect world, investors and managers would have symmetric information. That is, they would share the same understanding of the firm's future prospects. But in reality, this is rarely the case. More often, information is asymmetric. Managers know more about their company's risks and opportunities than outside investors ever could. This gap in knowledge creates uncertainty, and uncertainty leads investors to interpret management's actions, like taking on debt, as signals. Signaling in practice. So how does all of this actually play out? Let's suppose a firm issues new equity instead of using debt to fund a project. Investors might think, maybe management believes the stock is overvalued. Alternatively, if a company takes on debt, investors might see that as a positive signal, a show of confidence that future cash flows will be strong enough to cover the interest payments. Bottom line, managers often make financing decisions not just for economic reasons, but also for signaling purposes, and those signals influence how investors interpret the value of the firm. That wraps up this segment of our Week 3 live chat. We've explored capital structure theory, trade-offs, and how the psychology of signaling plays a critical role in corporate finance strategy. As always, if you have questions or just want to explore things a little further, drop a note in the Ask Questions discussion board or send me a message directly. And remember, the numbers may be rational, but investors, not always. See you online.